June 17th, 1957, 3:14 p.m. One sentence was about to leave a man's mouth, and by sundown, half of Harlem would belong to someone else. The courtroom on Center Street smelled of damp paper, hot summer wool, and old floor wax. Ceiling fans turned slowly above rows of tired spectators, moving heat from one corner of the room to another without cooling anything. Light from the high windows fell in pale bars across the polished floor. A bailiff stood near the rail with his hands folded behind his back. A court reporter waited with her fingers hovering over the machine. On the right side of the room, 3 reporters sat with notebooks open, sensing that something ugly was forming, though none of them yet understood how expensive ugliness could become. In the front row, a woman in a cream dress sat with her gloves folded neatly in her lap. She did not fidget, she did not whisper. She did not turn her head when the men behind her murmured her husband's name like it was both a warning and a superstition. Her hat was trimmed with a narrow band of dark silk. A string of pearls rested against her throat. She looked less like a witness than a woman attending church on a weekday afternoon, calm enough to make the room feel smaller. At the rear of the courtroom, Ellsworth Mayme Johnson sat perfectly still. He was known in Harlem by many names, and downtown by even more. To some, he was a criminal. To some, he was protection. To some, he was the quiet wall standing between a neighborhood and the kind of men who liked to feed on neighborhoods once City Hall looked away. But in that moment, he did not look like a king or a gangster or a legend. He looked like a husband watching the room the way a man watches a lit fuse. The judge had not yet spoken. He was still shuffling papers, adjusting his glasses, pretending that this hearing was routine. But there are moments when a room changes before a word is said. The spectators felt it, the reporters felt it, even the bailiff felt it. Something had already crossed the line between law and insult, and everyone present understood, in the private animal part of the mind that recognizes danger before reason does, that once that line was crossed in full daylight, the city would not be able to pull it back. Outside, the afternoon traffic crawled through lower Manhattan. A truck rattled over a pothole. A siren wailed somewhere uptown and faded. But inside that courtroom, time narrowed into the distance between a bench, a witness chair, and the woman in cream gloves, who had not come there to beg for mercy, had not come there to cry, had not come there to be broken in public for the satisfaction of men who mistook power for permission. In less than 10 minutes, the judge would open his mouth. By evening, men who had ruled blocks for years would be standing in back rooms with empty hands, wondering how an empire could move without a shot being fired. Harlem had always understood something downtown never truly learned. Humiliation is never small when the whole neighborhood is watching. And when a man chooses to shame a woman in public, he is not just testing her dignity, he is testing the structure that stands behind her. On that Monday afternoon in June, a judge looked at Bumpy Johnson's wife and saw a witness. What Harlem saw was a line drawn in front of everybody. And what happened after that became one of those stories that lived longer in whispers than in records, longer in the memory of bartenders and doormen and numbers runners than in any file stamped by the city. It was the day a courtroom insult did what guns and warrants had failed to do for years. It forced Harlem to choose, all over again, who truly held power once daylight ended. To understand why one sentence in a downtown courtroom could move money, loyalty, fear, and allegiance across an entire neighborhood by nightfall, you have to understand who Mayme Johnson was long before the judge ever saw her name on a docket. Mayme was not built for spectacle. She was built for composure. In a world crowded with loud men who mistook volume for authority, she had the rarer skill of making people lower their voices around her without ever asking. Harlem noticed things like that. Harlem noticed how she entered a room without rushing, how she listened before she answered, how she carried herself with the kind of dignity that made even women who did not trust gangsters admit that Bumpy Johnson had married a woman who could stand upright in any room in New York. That mattered more than outsiders understood, because by the mid-1950s, Bumpy's power was not just about muscle. Any fool with a pistol could frighten a corner for one night. Real power in Harlem lived in a network of invisible agreements. It lived in who got protected, who got warned, who got paid on time, who got left alone, who got embarrassed, and who got disappeared from polite conversation before they were ever disappeared from the street. It lived in the way club owners nodded when certain names were mentioned, in how policy bankers adjusted their books when certain men walked in how shopkeepers who hated paying tribute still preferred predictable tribute to chaos. And at the center of that reputation was not only Bumpy's violence, though men told enough stories about razors and back rooms and winter rivers to fill 10 lifetimes. It was his discipline. He read, he listened, he remembered. He understood that fear without order burns too hot and too fast. Fear tied to order becomes government. Mayme understood that too. She saw the part the streets never saw, the books on the table late at night, the handwriting in the margins, the slow discussions with men who arrived angry and left grateful. The way Bumpy could spend an hour talking to a minister, a jazz musician, a porter, and a union man in the same evening, and never once say the thing he actually wanted until the room had already given it to him. She knew better than most that his greatest weapon was not what happened in alleys. It was what happened in people's minds before they ever reached the alley. That is why men who wanted to weaken Bumpy often looked for a softer place to strike. They could not beat him cleanly in the streets. They could not outthink him in Harlem. So they looked for ways to make him react badly, to shame him into noise, to provoke the one thing every smart enemy wanted from a powerful man: a public mistake. By 1957, there were plenty of people who wanted that mistake. Some were downtown, wearing tailored suits and speaking in clean legal language about public order, tax compliance, nuisance properties, and organized vice. Some were midtown men with Italian surnames and polished shoes who had spent years watching the numbers money flowing through Harlem and wondering why so much of it stayed under black control. Some were local opportunists who had smiled in Bumpy's face, taken his protection, and then quietly asked themselves whether he was getting older, whether his reach was shortening, whether the city might finally be willing to back someone else. And then there was Judge Horace Bell. Bell had not been born to money, but he had married near enough to it that he carried himself as if the city had always belonged to men like him. He was sharp-featured, careful with his hair, precise with his ties, and deeply in love with the performance of authority. He liked being watched. He liked the silence that followed his gavel. He liked how frightened people became when he leaned forward and removed his glasses before asking a question. Men like Bell often convinced themselves they respected the law, when what they actually respected was their own ability to make other people feel small beneath it. For years, Bell had been useful to people who preferred their cruelty polished. He signed orders, he approved seizures, he buried complaints in procedure. He did not need to take cash in envelopes to be corrupt in the simple street sense. He was worse than that. He believed his own contempt was judgment. He had heard of Bumpy Johnson, of course. Every judge in Manhattan had. Bell understood just enough about Harlem to fear the headlines, and too little to fear the neighborhood. To him, Bumpy was a problem to be managed, a symbol to be disciplined, an urban infection to be reduced through public examples. He did not believe men like Bumpy could truly own anything lasting. At best, they rented fear until the city decided otherwise. Men like Bell always make the same mistake. They think a neighborhood is a map instead of a memory. The case that brought Mayme into his courtroom began, as these things often did, with property. On West 138th Street stood a narrow brownstone with worn steps, brass numbers polished by years of hands, and a storefront on the ground floor that had been a women's dress shop before the war. By 1957, the dresses were long gone. In their place was a modest office that officially handled small cash loans, private collections, and community accounts. Unofficially, everybody in Harlem knew the back room did what half the city pretended not to see. It moved policy money, quietly, efficiently, reliably. It was not the biggest book in Harlem, but it was a dependable one. And dependable money attracts wolves faster than flashy money ever does. The title to the building sat in the name of a holding company that pointed, through layers of paper and respectable signatures, to Mayme Johnson. That detail mattered. It gave the city and its friends a lever, not against Bumpy directly, against the person they believed would be easier to drag into the light. The first move came from a man named Vincent Carbone, though in Harlem most people just called him Vic. He was not a boss in the true sense. He was one of those men who survive by attaching themselves to whichever ceiling looks strongest. He had worked collections for Italians downtown, made friendly noises to black bankers uptown, and spent years offering the same smile to both sides while meaning loyalty to neither. Vic understood something before many others did. If you could put Harlem's money under legal pressure, then street power would begin to tremble on its own. He fed a set of allegations to the city: improper accounts, unreported cash movement, coercive lending, use of property for unlawful gaming purposes. None of it was new. Some of it was true in the broad way such things were always true, but truth was not the point. Timing was. Vic wanted the building tied up, the accounts frozen, and the operation forced into court under the eye of a judge he knew despised the kind of dignity Harlem wore best. Once the paperwork started moving, Bell did the rest. He ordered an accelerated hearing. He denied a request to delay. He allowed broad questioning about ownership and household finances, and most importantly, he had Mayme subpoenaed to appear in person under the claim that her name sat on documents essential to determining whether the property was being used as a criminal front. When word of the subpoena reached Harlem, nobody liked it. Not because the court was especially dangerous in the obvious sense. The city had dragged women into court before. Wives had sat through hearings, answered questions, kept their faces steady, and gone home. But this felt different from the start. It had the smell of theatre. People heard Bell's name and understood there would be a performance, and that the woman being placed under those lights had not been chosen for what she knew, but for what her public posture represented. For 3 days before the hearing, Harlem talked in low voices. At the beauty shop on 7th Avenue, women pretended to discuss fabric, while actually discussing whether Bell would dare raise his voice. At the barber shop near 135th, men speculated not about the case itself, but about Bumpy's reaction if disrespect entered the room. At Small's Paradise, a trumpet player told a waiter that Bell was digging his own grave. The waiter said no, not a grave, a vacancy. Graves were for men who got found. Bumpy heard all of it and said very little. That was the first thing that unsettled people. He did not storm anywhere. He did not send loud warnings. He did not have anyone beaten in advance. He treated the hearing the way a chess player treats the first move from a man who thinks he has invented pressure. Quietly, carefully. He instructed his lawyer to prepare. He instructed Mayme to go dressed as herself, not as fear expected her to dress. He attended church on Sunday. He read late into the night. He smoked by the window and watched rain start over Harlem just before dawn. When Mayme asked him, the night before the hearing, whether Bell wanted the truth or the humiliation, Bumpy took a long time to answer. "He wants the room," he said at last. "Men like that always want the room." Mayme looked at him from the edge of the bed, studying the face most of New York knew only through rumor. "And if he takes it?" Bumpy shook his head once. "Nobody takes a room forever." The hearing began just after 3 o'clock. Bell came in dry and cool from his chambers, as if the summer heat belonged to everyone beneath him. The city attorney sat smug and over-prepared. Vic Carboni positioned himself one row behind the city table, close enough to observe, but far enough to pretend he was only an interested party. Two detectives sat near the aisle, with the loose, bored posture of men who knew they were being seen and enjoyed it. In the rear, Bumpy sat alone. No bodyguards, no fuss. Just a dark suit, a folded pocket square, and eyes that seemed more patient than the room deserved. Mayme was called midway through the proceedings. She stood, approached the witness chair, and took the oath in an even voice. Bell watched her like a man looking for a seam in stone. The first questions were routine: name, address, relationship to the holding company, length of residence, familiarity with the property. Had she ever signed documents on behalf of the business? Had she visited the location? Did she know who maintained the accounts? Bell let the city attorney do the early work while he studied her posture. She answered carefully, neither defensive nor submissive. She confirmed what could be confirmed, denied what could be denied, and refused to guess at what she had not personally handled. A lesser man might have ended there. Bell leaned forward. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "are you asking this court to believe that a woman of your background personally acquired and maintained legal title to a revenue-producing Manhattan property without assistance from men engaged in criminal enterprise?" The room stiffened. It was not the question alone, it was the arrangement of it. The weight placed on woman, the contempt resting on background, the invitation for laughter that stopped just short of being explicit. Mayme heard it. Everyone heard it. She answered without haste. "I am asking the court to believe what the papers say and what I have sworn to, Your Honor." Bell smiled thinly. "The papers," he said. "Yes, Harlem is very fond of papers when gentlemen cannot testify safely themselves." A reporter lifted his head. Still, Mayme did not move. The city attorney asked a few more questions. Bell interrupted twice. Each interruption carried more edge than the last. He asked whether she understood the difference between legal ownership and decorative ownership. A few people in the room shifted in discomfort. He asked whether she had ever been advised by her husband on how to answer questions. He asked whether her clothing and jewelry had been purchased from lawful income. Each question walked further from fact and closer to spectacle. Then came the moment. Bell removed his glasses and looked directly at her over clasped hands. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut the air cleanly in half, "you may carry yourself like a society lady, but in this courtroom you are still just the wife of a Harlem racketeer. Do not mistake silk gloves for respectability." The words landed harder because the room was silent enough to hear the ceiling fan click. Mayme did not lower her eyes, but something changed in the temperature. Even the court reporter paused half a beat before resuming. One of the detectives looked toward the rear of the room, not because anyone had moved, but because they had all suddenly remembered who was sitting there. Bell was not done. "When respectable women enter this court," he continued, "they arrive with honesty, not performance." That was the humiliation. Not loud, not theatrical in the cheap sense. Worse, polished, public, designed to strip dignity from a woman under oath while giving the speaker just enough legal cover to call it judicial impatience. For 2 seconds, nobody breathed. Then Bell turned a page, as if the thing had already been done and could not be recalled. Mayme answered in a voice so steady it made the insult look clumsy. "With respect, Your Honor, a woman does not become dishonest because a man in a robe decides not to respect her." A murmur spread through the room like a match touching dry paper. Bell banged the gavel once. "Control your witness," he snapped toward the defense table, though she had been more controlled than anyone else in the room. But the damage was already done, and not to Mayme. Bell thought he had reduced her. What he had actually done was reveal himself. He had shown the room, the reporters, the attorneys, the detectives, Vic Carbone, and most importantly, Bumpy Johnson, that he was willing to use the bench not to examine facts, but to humiliate a woman because he believed her husband could be provoked into foolishness. That kind of mistake is manageable with small men. With disciplined men, it becomes evidence. The hearing continued another 12 minutes, though no one later remembered much of those 12 minutes except the noise of papers and the sense that everybody was now trapped inside consequences that had not yet arrived. Bell adjourned with an order to review the accounts, maintain temporary pressure on the property, and reconvene in 3 days. It sounded procedural, it sounded safe, it sounded like the law had spoken. Mayme rose. Bumpy rose at the rear. Neither of them looked at Bell. As she stepped into the aisle, 3 reporters stood at once. One asked whether she had any response to the court's remarks. Another asked whether Mr. Johnson planned to appeal. A third, younger and foolish, asked whether the judge had gone too far. Mayme stopped just long enough to put on one glove. "The judge said what he wished to say," she replied. "Now everyone else will decide what it meant." She walked out. That sentence made the papers the next day, though not on page 1. Bumpy followed her into the corridor. The detectives watched for a sign, any sign, a curse, a threat, a jaw tightening, a finger pointed back toward the bench. They saw none of it. Bumpy helped Mayme with her other glove, the way any careful husband might. They moved through the crowd. He placed one hand lightly at the small of her back. He did not hurry. He did not speak to the reporters. He did not give the city the thing it was hoping to catch. Vic Carbone saw them pass and felt the first pinch of doubt. Because men like Vic know violence, they know tempers, they know boasts shouted in hallways, and revenge promised loudly enough for cowards to hide behind policemen. What they fear is the other kind, the kind that says nothing because it is already working. At 3:52 p.m., Mayme and Bumpy stepped into the thick heat of the street outside the courthouse. A black sedan waited at the curb. The driver opened the rear door. Mayme got in first. Bumpy paused half a second with one hand on the roof of the car and looked back toward the courthouse steps. He did not glare, he did not sneer. He simply looked. A messenger boy across the street would later swear that Bumpy's face held no anger at all, and that was what frightened him most. By 4:07 p.m., the first call had been made. It went from a drugstore payphone on Canal Street to a funeral home on 139th, where the undertaker listened without interrupting, said only, "I understand," and hung up. The undertaker then made 2 calls of his own, one to a pastor's office and one to the manager of a social club that operated above a fish market after dark. Neither call lasted more than 20 seconds. At 4:16 p.m., a porter at the Hotel Teresa carried a folded note upstairs to room 314, where a banker from 133rd Street read it once and left by the side entrance instead of the lobby. At 4:22 p.m., a woman at a beauty parlor on Lenox stopped in the middle of rolling a customer's hair and asked the apprentice to cover for her. She crossed the street to a luncheonette, spoke quietly to a busboy, and returned before the curlers cooled. At 4:31 p.m., 2 numbers writers on 136th received the same message from different mouths. "Hold the evening books. Do not settle with Carbone's men. Wait." No threats accompanied the instruction. That was important. Threats belong to uncertainty. This was not uncertainty. It was a transfer order disguised as patience. By 5 o'clock, Harlem knew. Not every detail, not Bell's exact wording, not the language of the subpoena, but the shape of it. A judge downtown had humiliated Mayme Johnson in open court. That was enough. In neighborhoods that survive by reading tone before fact, the specifics arrive later. The meaning arrives instantly. Old women spoke of it on stoops, with a quiet fury men often fail to understand. Ministers heard it before evening prayer. Bartenders heard it before their first heavy crowd. Club doormen heard it from cab drivers. Policy writers heard it from women carrying groceries who had never placed a bet in their lives, but understood insult when it was directed at someone who represented the neighborhood's poise. And the most dangerous part was this. Many of those people were not afraid for Mayme, they were angry for themselves. Because Bell had not merely insulted a wife, he had insulted a form of black dignity that Harlem had spent decades building against every public room designed to deny it. He had looked at polish and composure and called it performance. He had turned respectability into accusation. He had reminded the neighborhood that downtown still believed a woman from Harlem entered a courtroom already guilty of being seen in the wrong kind of silk. That sort of insult does not stay personal for long. At 5:18 p.m., Bumpy sat in the back office of a modest restaurant off 7th Avenue with 3 men and 1 woman. The men were Isaiah Carr, a soft-spoken policy banker whose calm disguised the fact that he remembered every debt ever owed to him. Reverend Elijah Boone, who understood that moral outrage sometimes travels fastest through practical arrangements, and Otis Greer, a union steward with broad hands and a habit of saying little until he had already solved the problem. The woman was Lottie Ames, owner of a beauty shop and one of the best unofficial intelligence operators in Upper Manhattan, because women told hairdressers what they would never tell husbands, lawyers, or priests. On the table lay coffee, a half-eaten plate of fish, 4 ashtrays, and a narrow ledger. Bumpy did not begin with Bell. He began with Vic Carbone. "Who settles for him tonight?" he asked. Isaiah answered first. 8 men directly, 4 more through clerks. "Who stays loyal if the room changes?" 3, Isaiah said. "Maybe 4 if they're stupid." "Who's carrying paper?" "Rinaldi, maybe Torres, but Torres is only loyal to the next sunrise." Bumpy nodded once. "What time do the books usually close?" "Varies," Isaiah said, "but if they're nervous they'll close early, between 8 and 9. Bumpy took a sip of coffee and looked at Reverend Boone. "How loud do you want Sunday?" Boone asked. "Not loud," Bumpy said. "Clean." Boone understood at once. There would be no pulpit threats, no public sermon naming names, nothing crude enough to give the city language. But Sunday would come with memory attached. Congregations would hear about dignity, about women shamed in rooms built to reduce them, about the limits of borrowed power. Not tonight. Soon. Tonight was for movement. Lottie lit a cigarette. "The women are hot," she said. "Hotter than the men." "That's good," Bumpy replied. "Good?" Otis asked. Bumpy rested both hands flat on the table. "Men rush," he said. "Women remember. Tonight, I need memory." That was the moment the plan clarified. This would not be revenge in the vulgar sense. Bell would not be shot. No judge was going to vanish into the river. That would be too simple, too noisy, too useful to the city. And Vic Carbone, for all his scheming, was not important enough to kill in anger. Importance had to be taken from him, not spilled out of him. Bell had humiliated Mayme in public to produce a reaction. Bumpy would answer by converting public anger into structured withdrawal. Harlem would not scream. Harlem would close its hand. At 5:46 p.m., the first part of the hand closed. Vic Carbone's collector, a heavy man named Lou Sapp, entered a pool hall on 134th to make the early round and found 6 men playing and none willing to look at him. Normally, the owner would have handed over a packet before Lou even asked. That evening, the owner simply wiped a glass and said, "No settlement tonight." Lou laughed because he thought it was a joke. The owner kept wiping the glass. "Since when?" Lou asked. "Since today." Lou went to 2 more stops. Same answer. No packet, no argument. Just a wall of stillness that told him he was already late to information others had received. At 6:03 p.m., a car that usually transported slips downtown left empty. At 6:11 p.m., a dancer finishing a set at a club on Lenox whispered to the cashier that no one in the back room would touch Carbone's paper after dark. The cashier asked who had said so. The dancer replied, "Everybody." At 6:20 p.m., one of Vic's bookkeepers received a visit from his sister, who never came to his office and now arrived carrying a pie box. Inside the pie box was not pie, but a note written in a hand he recognized from church announcements. It contained only 6 words: "Do not settle with him tonight." He read it twice, looked out the window toward the avenue, and for the first time that day felt truly afraid. Meanwhile, Bell went home. He left chambers at 6:27 p.m., carrying his briefcase and the stale satisfaction of a man who believed he had been firm where others would have been sentimental. One assistant mentioned that the afternoon had felt tense. Bell waved it off. "They always want theatre," he said. "You deny it to them and they call it cruelty." He took a car north, stopped for a haircut on the way, and reached his apartment before 7:30. His wife asked whether the hearing had gone well. Bell told her it had been unpleasant but necessary. Then he loosened his tie, took a drink, and never once imagined that while he was sitting in lamplight discussing fish for dinner, the neighborhood he had insulted was redrawing itself. At 6:48 p.m., Vic Carboni finally understood the scale of the trouble. He was in the upstairs office above a cigar shop, waiting for the first bundles from the evening collection, when Lou Sapp came in sweating through his collar. Behind him was Rinaldi, pale and angry. "Well?" Vic asked. Lou set an empty satchel on the desk. Vic stared at it. "What is this?" Lou swallowed. "Nobody's settling." Vic rose so fast his chair struck the wall. "Nobody?" "Not the West Side stops, not the bars, not the pool halls. The church office on 141st closed the window. The beauty parlor on 7th told me to come back next week if I still had a route." Rinaldi cut in. "2 clerks quit, just walked. One of them left the key." Vic felt the back of his neck go cold. "Who's saying it?" Lou shook his head. "No one's saying nothing. That's the problem. Silence is the final form of consensus." Vic knew it now. No threats meant everyone had already agreed. If Bumpy had sent enforcers, there would have been room to fight. But this was worse. Doors were simply not opening. Vic slammed his palm down on the desk. "Get me Bell." Rinaldi hesitated. "The judge?" "Yes, the damn judge." "You can't call a judge about this." Vic stared at him. "I'm not calling about this," he said. "I'm calling because he started it." But Bell did not come to the phone. A maid said he was at dinner. By 7:05 p.m., the second part of the hand closed. At the basement lounge of a social club near 132nd Street, 6 policy captains sat around a green table beneath a yellow light. They had each operated independently enough to flatter themselves into thinking independence was real. In practice, every one of them relied on peace. Peace meant roots. Roots meant money. Money meant someone had to hold the balance when outsiders pushed. For years, that balance had been complicated. Bits of Harlem paid one way, bits another. Men hedged. Men paid both sides when they feared change. That evening, Bumpy entered without escort. He took off his hat, laid it on the chair beside him, and looked around the table without speaking. No one sat until he sat. Then Isaiah Carr placed the narrow ledger from the restaurant on the felt. One by one, the captains added their route books. Names, windows, collectors, safe houses, percentages, corner stores, back offices, Wednesday runners, Saturday payers. The hidden map of Harlem's evening money spread across the table under one hanging bulb. "Tonight," Bumpy said quietly, "we stop paying confusion." No one interrupted. "You don't owe me noise," he continued. "You owe yourselves order. Downtown thinks it can shame our women and sort our books in the same afternoon. If you want that future, keep your paper where it is. If you want another one, put it here." He touched the ledger once with 2 fingers. That was all. No speech about honor, no threats, no grandstanding. Men who truly command do not need to thicken the air with themselves. The first captain reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. The second laid down a ring of keys. The third slid over 2 folded route sheets and whispered, almost to himself, "Enough." By 7:29 p.m., 12 routes had changed hands. By 7:41 p.m., 16 had. At 7:52 p.m., a messenger carried word to the owner of a nightclub, long neutral in public and flexible in private. The owner listened, stared at the stage where the band was warming up, then told the cashier to settle only with Carr's people from that night forward. The cashier asked whether Vic Carbone would object. The owner said, "Not here, he won't." At 8:03 p.m., Bumpy returned home for exactly 9 minutes. Mayme was in the sitting room with the lamp on low, shoes removed, hat set neatly beside the sofa. There was a bruise on her pride, but none on her posture. When Bumpy came in, she looked at his face and knew immediately that motion had begun. "Is it ugly?" she asked. He considered the question. "No," he said, "not ugly." "What is it?" "Accurate." That made her smile for the first time since the courthouse. He sat beside her, not touching her yet, just close enough to let the day settle between them without filling it with explanation. Outside, somewhere down the block, boys shouted over a game on the sidewalk. A radio played from a neighboring apartment. Ordinary sounds. That is how power shifts most often happen. Not under thunder, under ordinary evening noise while most of the city assumes nothing has moved. After a while, Mayme said, "He wanted the room." Bumpy nodded. "He got it for a moment," she said. "Moments are expensive," Bumpy replied. Then he took her hand, kissed her knuckles once, rose, and went back out. At 8:21 p.m., Bell's phone rang during coffee. He answered with mild irritation and heard a city council aide on the line, speaking in the strained tone of a man trying to sound calm, because he already knows calm is no longer available. "Judge," the aide said, "did something happen in your courtroom this afternoon?" Bell frowned. "Of course something happened. I held a hearing." "No, I mean with Johnson's wife." Bell felt the first small stab of offense that powerful men feel when they are forced to describe themselves to inferiors. "I conducted myself appropriately." There was a pause. "I'm getting calls," the aide said, "from uptown, from pastors, from 2 club owners, 1 banker, a women's group. They're all using the same word." Bell set down his cup. "What word?" "Humiliation." Bell almost laughed. "Good God!" The aide did not laugh with him. "And," the aide continued, "Carbone's people are saying settlements have stopped." Bell went silent. That, finally, was language he understood. He had no moral imagination for insult, but he understood disruption. "That is not my concern," he said too quickly. "Maybe not," the aide replied, "but if this gets tied to your hearing, it becomes your concern by breakfast." Bell muttered something about hysteria, promised to review the transcript, and ended the call. But the drink in his hand no longer tasted right. At 8:37 p.m., Vic Carbone made his last real attempt to regain the evening. He arrived in person at the club on Lenox that had just shifted settlements. He entered through the front, saw the band already playing, and understood at once that coming through the front had been a mistake. Men at the bar did not turn to look at him. That was worse than hostility. Hostility still recognizes your existence. Indifference means you have already been downgraded. Vic pushed through to the office in back and found the owner sitting with the cash drawer open. "You're late," the owner said. "For what?" "For learning." Vic shut the door behind him. "You settling with me or not?" The owner looked down at the open drawer, then back up. "No." Vic stepped closer. "Because of a judge?" The owner shook his head slowly. "Because of a woman." That answer broke something in Vic he could not repair, because he understood then that this was larger than business. If the reason had been fear alone, he could still maneuver. But once women in a neighborhood decide a man stands on the wrong side of an insult, the streets become moral in a way that frightens practical criminals. Men who can be bribed out of strategy cannot be bribed out of shame once it becomes communal. Vic cursed, knocked a glass from the desk, and left through the back. At 9:04 p.m., the third and final part of the hand closed. In the upper room of a brownstone on 136th Street, with the curtains half drawn against the city, Bumpy sat at the head of a long table. Isaiah Carr stood to his right. Otis Greer stood near the window. Lottie Ames leaned against a bookshelf, smoking her second cigarette of the night. One by one, the men who mattered came in. Not the loudest men, the necessary ones. A pastor, a club owner, a teamster, a policy captain from Sugar Hill, a woman who controlled 3 apartment building superintendents and therefore half the gossip in 2 precincts, a former numbers queen who no longer wrote slips but whose opinions still carried weight in back rooms. Even 2 men who had once played both sides entered, hats in hand, and waited to be told whether they were still welcome in the new order. On the table sat ledgers, satchels, route maps, and a tin box containing keys to 3 locations previously controlled by Carbone's collectors. No guns, no blood, no masks. Just the instruments of ownership, moving from one center of gravity to another. Bumpy did not smile. He simply checked each item as if it had always been inevitable. At 9:17 p.m., Isaiah read the new percentages aloud. Fairer than some expected, tougher than others hoped. Bumpy was not punishing Harlem, he was stabilizing it. That is how you know the difference between vengeance and governance. Vengeance spends power to soothe pain. Governance spends pain to buy order. At 9:26 p.m., Reverend Boone asked, "And Bell?" Every face in the room turned slightly. Bumpy looked at the ledger before answering. "Bell sits where he sat this morning," he said, "but he does not sit over the same city." No one asked for more. That line would travel further than any threat could have. By 9:40 p.m., word reached 3 precinct houses that Harlem was unusually quiet. Patrolmen drove the avenues and found no broken windows, no bodies, no shouting crowds. Yet every experienced cop felt something had changed. The quiet had direction. Too many corners were calm in the same deliberate way. Too many men were standing differently. Too many people looked like they had already received instructions the police had not. At 10:02 p.m., Bell made the mistake of calling Vic Carbone back. Vic answered on the 3rd ring, breathless and furious. "What have you done?" Bell demanded. Vic laughed without humor. "What have I done? I gave you a stage, Judge. You used it. You told me the woman was leverage." "She was," Vic snapped, "until you made her a symbol." Bell clenched the receiver. "You said Johnson would react." "He did. I mean, violently." Vic was quiet for one long second. "That's why you lost," he said. Bell nearly shouted after that, accusing, denying, trying to separate himself from the consequences of an afternoon he had authored with his own mouth. But the call ended where all such calls end, with 2 men discovering that each had overestimated the value of the other. Bell had thought Vic controlled Harlem's money. Vic had thought Bell controlled legitimacy. By nightfall, neither claim held. Harlem had routed around both of them. At 10:35 p.m., Bumpy stood alone for a moment in the upstairs room after most of the others had gone. The ledgers were stacked, the keys were sorted, the new routes were assigned. Harlem's money had not doubled, no miracle had occurred. What had changed was subtler and far more important. Ambiguity had ended. Men who spent years pretending neutrality had chosen. Women who were rarely invited into formal power had triggered that choice. The city had reached into Harlem with contempt and found that contempt cost more than expected. Isaiah approached from the doorway. "It's done," he said. Bumpy looked out through the slit in the curtain at the avenue below. "For tonight," he replied. "You think Carbone runs?" "Eventually." "And the judge?" Bumpy's eyes did not leave the street. "The judge wakes up tomorrow in the same bed, puts on the same robe, walks into the same courthouse." He paused. "But the stories get there before he does." That was exactly what happened. By dawn, Bell's courtroom staff had heard versions of the previous day from 3 different sources. By breakfast, 2 columnists had calls from uptown about the hearing. By noon, a civic women's association had submitted a letter protesting the judge's conduct. By the next afternoon, a church committee was discussing judicial dignity from the pulpit without naming him. A week later, one of Bell's political patrons advised him, gently and then not so gently, that his handling of the Johnson hearing had created unnecessary complications. Nothing dramatic happened on paper. Men like Bell are rarely punished in ways visible enough to satisfy the street. There was no public rebuke, no headline confession, no confession at all. But his requests began meeting delay. A promotion he wanted never arrived. A transfer he did not want did. Invitations thinned, smiles cooled. Men who had once laughed readily in his chambers now kept their jokes for private rooms. He remained a judge, yes, but not the same kind. The city had a way of sanding status down without ever admitting why. As for Vic Carbone, his decline was faster. Without the evening routes, he was not a strategist. He was a middleman with a shrinking circle of callers. 3 weeks later, one of his bookkeepers disappeared to Philadelphia. 2 months later, a downtown partner stopped returning his messages. By winter, Vic was still alive, still dressed well, still telling stories about comebacks in bars where no one believed in them. But his hours were over. Not because Bumpy crushed him dramatically, because Harlem stopped needing him all at once. That is the kind of death certain men deserve most. The building on 138th remained under scrutiny for a time, but the city never gained the leverage it wanted. The books were cleaned faster than Bell had expected, testimony shifted, witnesses turned precise. A separate property question elsewhere suddenly became more urgent to the same offices pressing the case. Momentum evaporated. The hearing that was supposed to weaken Bumpy's structure had, in practice, consolidated it. Men who had been uncertain before were no longer uncertain. Women who had tolerated many things drew a harder line around certain forms of disrespect. And in Harlem, once the women fixed the moral meaning of an event, the men usually followed if they were wise. People told the story in different ways afterward. Some said Bell used a slur, others said he did not need one. Some said Bumpy made a single phone call from the courthouse steps, and that was enough. Others swore the shift had been prepared for months, and the insult merely provided the perfect public reason. Some insisted that 3 men met Carbone in an alley later that week and persuaded him never to return uptown. Some said no alley was needed. The neighborhood had already delivered its verdict. Stories grow where records fail, and Harlem has never required paperwork to preserve truth in the shape that matters. But everyone agreed on 3 points. A judge humiliated Bumpy Johnson's wife in open court. That evening, men who thought they were secure discovered security had changed addresses. And no shot was fired to make it happen. Years later, old bartenders still liked to point at the stool where a collector sat the night he realized no one would settle with him anymore. Hairdressers told young girls about the day a woman's calm in court became stronger than the bench itself. Old men in parks spoke of Bell with a kind of amused contempt, as if he were a professor who leaned too close to a stove and learned physics by pain. Ministers referred to the incident without names when preaching about the difference between dignity and vanity. Club owners remembered the exact feeling of the room when the transfer books opened. And women who had never liked gangsters much still admitted, with the complicated honesty of people who have survived real neighborhoods, that there was something just about the way that particular insult had been answered. Because what changed hands in Harlem that evening was more than policy routes and envelopes. Permission changed hands. The city lost permission to believe it could shame Harlem's women without paying a social price. Men on the fence lost permission to pretend neutrality when dignity was publicly attacked. Opportunists lost permission to imagine the neighborhood's memory was short. And Bumpy, without raising his voice or reaching for theatrical revenge, reminded everybody from the courthouse to the corner store that the deepest authority is not the power to strike, it is the power to decide what the strike costs afterward. That is why the story lasted. Not because it was the bloodiest, it was not. Not because it was the loudest, it was not. It lasted because it revealed something permanent about power. A bench can command silence for a few minutes. A badge can command fear for a few streets. A gang can command obedience for a few nights. But only dignity can command loyalty once people have seen it insulted and still refuse to kneel. Bell thought he was humiliating a witness. He was actually clarifying the moral map of Harlem for everyone watching. He turned Mayme into a measure, and once the neighborhood measured itself against that moment, weak allegiances snapped. That is the danger of public contempt. It never travels alone. It carries revelation with it. In the end, Bell kept his robe, but lost his certainty. Vic kept breathing, but lost his roots. The city kept its buildings and paperwork and careful language, but lost the belief that Harlem's poise meant softness. And Mayme Johnson, who entered the courtroom in cream gloves and left with her head high, remained exactly what she had been before the first question was asked and the last whisper had faded. Proof that composure is not fragility, and that sometimes the woman seated in silence is the center of the entire storm. There are men who think power belongs to the hand that slams the gavel. There are men who think it belongs to the hand that holds the gun. On June 17, 1957, Harlem learned once again that both hands are temporary. Real power belongs to the people who can be insulted in public and still choose the moment, the method, and the price of the reply. That afternoon, a judge looked down from the bench and mistook dignity for performance. That evening, the neighborhood corrected him. And after that, whenever certain men entered rooms believing that humiliation was a useful tool, somebody older and wiser would lean back, lower his voice, and say the same thing. Be careful with a woman who knows how to leave a room standing up. The last time Judge Bell saw Mayme Johnson was months later, by accident, on the courthouse steps. He was coming down. She was going up, not for herself, but alongside a church committee handling another matter entirely. Bell recognized her before she looked at him. He slowed, perhaps expecting coldness, perhaps bracing for the memory of what he had said. Mayme stopped one step below him, gloved hand resting on the rail, and met his eyes with the same calm she had carried through the hearing. She did not mention the insult. She did not accuse. She did not need to. "Good afternoon, Your Honor," she said. Then she continued up the steps, while he remained there for half a second too long, a man in a robe, realizing that the room he once thought he owned had followed her out months ago and never quite come back. That was the final lesson of it. Humiliation is easy. Any coward with status can do it. Mastery is harder. Mastery is knowing when not to answer in the language your enemy has chosen for you. Mastery is turning an insult into a referendum, pain into alignment, anger into structure. Mastery is understanding that a neighborhood does not truly belong to the man who frightens it most. It belongs to the one who can teach it how to remember. Bell had law. Carbone had schemes. Bumpy had Harlem. And Mayme had the one thing that made all of Harlem decide in a single evening where it stood. She had carried disrespect without surrendering an ounce of herself. After that, the rest was just accounting.